Okay, this should be the last part of the 1970s, and we are going to finish with kind of some set events that occur from 1973, 74, and then we're going to take that up through 1979. The last domestic event that we need to talk about with Richard Nixon is, of course, Watergate. And so you can see Watergate there in the top right hand picture, the left hand side. But at Watergate was an office kind of building, or an office, I guess you would say, an office for the Democratic headquarters. And unbeknownst to Nixon, it's pretty clear that he didn't know. He obviously, with the evidence that we have, never ordered the the group of people that went into the Democratic headquarters to try to bug them and to try to find documents and things like that to see what the strategy was for the upcoming 1972 election. It's pretty clear that Nixon never ordered that, but what the group did was they went in and they bugged the office. They tried to find strategy and stuff like that, but then they got caught. And once they started doing background checks, on the group, they found out that a couple of them had some pretty interesting ties, and that they worked for this group that I think has a kind of a funny name called CREEP, so the Committee to Reelect the President. And one of the guys even was part of the White House staff at one point. And so these are people that had, ties to the president almost, either directly or indirectly. And at first, Nixon dismissed it, and for quite some time, actually, the Watergate investigation really didn't get much traction. But as they kind of started prying and doing more digging and finding more research and more information, the trail of breadcrumbs kept leading back to the White House itself. And so, what investigators wanted to know was, what did Nixon know and when did he know it? And so it starts this, this big Senate committee on investigating it. And eventually, what they find through digging this up is that Nixon did not know about the break-in, but what they couldn't exactly rule out was, like, did he cover it up? Like, did he try to get rid of the evidence of people that were trying to make sure that this didn't get found out? And so investigators started wondering, what is he using the FBI? Is he using the CIA? What was going on? And so they put pressure on these people that they had arrested. And as they put them to trial, and as Judge Sirica, as he started grilling them and asking them questions, it started leading to a floodgate of information that again led directly back to the president. Now, probably the two smoking guns, I guess you could say, as it were James McCord and John Dean. And in particular, John Dean, the guy you can see on the right there, he was the legal counsel for the White House. In other words, he was kind of, if the White House had a legal question about, some sort of legal matters, that's who they asked. So it's almost like Nixon's lawyer. And when they had found evidence that he had used the government the wrong way, they started pressuring Dean. And between McCord and Dean and a couple of other people that were associated with Nixon, they found out some pretty interesting things. One of those things was that Nixon had been recording conversations in the White House. And so Dean, who had a pretty impressive memory, he had given prosecutors dates and times when Nixon had been talking about the cover up when Dean was there. And so almost immediately, the prosecutors were like, hey, we need to get our hands on those tapes. Now, of course, Nixon refused. But what he did do is he created basically an investigation committee to get to the bottom of it, to just kind of make himself look good, like he wasn't trying to hide anything. And so the special prosecutor Archibald Cox, as he takes up the case, he tried to sue Nixon in court, and Nixon basically fired him. And the people that had put Archibald Cox kind of on the case, they were the attorney general and the deputy attorney general. Well, they resigned in protest. And so this is starting to make Nixon look really bad. Now, when Archibald Cox was fired, when the attorney general resigned, when his deputy attorney general resigned, this is kind of known as the Saturday Night Massacre. And now Nixon was kind of in full retreat. He ends up assigning another prosecutor by the name of Leon Jaworski, and Leon Jaworski even tries to sue Nixon in federal court, which ends up happening. And so in U.S. versus Nixon, the Supreme Court ruled that Nixon had to turn over the tapes from his White House taping. And once those tapes are turned over, it makes Nixon look really bad. First of all, there are missing segments from the tapes. And now Nixon cited what he called national security privilege, that if what was said on those tapes would be allowed to play, that it would endanger America's security or America's safety, because what they were talking about was so high level. But enough of the tapes got released that it was pretty clear that if Nixon were to be put on trial himself, he probably would have been guilty. There's enough in the Nixon tapes to show that he, even though he did not know about the Watergate break-in, he did not order the Watergate break-in, he certainly tried to cover it up. And he certainly tried to use the FBI to harass people, to obstruct them from investigating. And you know, when people did not comply with him, well, then he just had them fired. So really, after U.S. versus Nixon, it's all over for Nixon. And really, they were on their way to impeaching him. He would have been impeached. But he decided to just kind of beat him to the punch. And so he ended up becoming the first American president to ever resign from office. Okay, and so that is Watergate. At this point, there's really a crisis in confidence in terms of the American government. A lot of people had very negative opinions and thoughts about the American government, and there's a lot of causes to that. One would be the turbulent cultural upheaval, everything from the new left, the countercultures, obviously civil rights movements, and some of the movements we talked in class with the women's rights, American Indian, Latino activism, and then, of course, the gay rights movement. Another one that was causing a crisis of confidence for Americans was just the utter failure of Vietnam. Remember that Vietnam is, they're a third world country. It should have been something to where the United States should have come in and easily defeated, and we could not. And we lost a lot of lives. We lost psychologically. We lost physically. And remember also with the kind of the credibility gap, where the American government was telling us that the war was going well, and then we would find out that it wasn't. And so that all kind of adds to, we don't really trust our government. We don't really like them. We don't really know if what they're saying is correct. Now, add to all this, we have a bad economy throughout the 1970s. And so because of LBJ's insistence on fighting guns and butter, fighting the war on poverty and Vietnam at the same time, this is going to lead to a lot of deficit spending, a lot of inflation, and then as unemployment starts to go up, we have that stagflating economy. And so we have no trust in leaders. We didn't talk about the Pentagon Papers, but basically the Pentagon Papers was something that the New York Times were able to get their hands on that showed that the American government escalated the Vietnam War, and that they intended to do it before they had congressional approval. So it's just another thing in the credibility gap. We just don't trust our government in terms of what they tell us. Okay, the rest of the 70s doesn't really go that well either in terms of dynamic leadership and things like that. And just to emphasize this, Jerry Ford, I can't imagine AP will ask a question about Jerry Ford other than to say Jerry Ford is the guy that takes over after Nixon. By this time, we have created what's called the 25th Amendment. And the 25th Amendment had said that when there's a vacancy for vice presidency, that the president would be able to fill that vacancy. It also talks about presidential succession. So, for example, if a president died, then the vice president would take over. If the vice president died as well, then the Speaker of the House of Representatives would take over. So it kind of creates a presidential succession. But while this is important for this conversation, is that Spiro Agnew, who was the vice president for Nixon, he also got himself in trouble, and he got convicted of taking a bribe while he was the governor of Maryland. And so he had to resign from being vice president. So that left an opening for Nixon before he himself had to resign. And while Nixon was still president, he filled that vacancy of Spiro Agnew with a guy named Jerry Ford. Jerry Ford was a congressman from Michigan. By all accounts, he was a pretty good dude, a pretty solid guy. Probably wasn't the highest in terms of being an intellect, but he was a pretty solid president in terms of being just a good person after Nixon. Okay, almost immediately though, Ford's popularity starts to come down. One of the first things he does is to pardon Nixon. A lot of people wanted to see Nixon not only leave office but also get convicted of crimes in federal courts, and effectively Ford ended the possibility of that. He said, we need to move on, we need to heal, and so he pardoned Nixon, and almost immediately his popularity went down. Probably his brightest moment in terms of foreign policy would be the Helsinki Accords. This was an agreement made by really Western European countries and the United States with the Soviet Union and with Eastern European countries, where they recognized borders. They recognized that they needed to work together in terms of humanitarian efforts, in terms of ecological efforts, and so they really they just kind of said, hey, we acknowledge that you exist. We think that you should treat your people well. And that's pretty much as far as it got. It was actually not binding, and nothing much more came of the Helsinki Accords. In 1975, we also see the fall of Vietnam. So just briefly, let's go back. In 1973, Nixon and Henry Kissinger had engineered the Peace of Paris Accords, which created the division of Vietnam at the 17th parallel. But the problem with that agreement is that America did not insist on the Viet Cong being removed from the South. And so the Viet Cong stayed. Remember, the Viet Cong are basically fighters backed by the North Vietnamese government. And so by 1975, the North invades the South again, but this time there's no United States to help. The South Vietnamese reach out to the government. Congress basically says no, and we allow Vietnam to fall. And so really that whole idea of stopping the spread of communism, that was a big failure on our part. All right, the other thing you need to know about both Jerry Ford and Jimmy Carter, as he will eventually become president, is that they're dealing with a really bad economy. Remember, we talked about stagflation in the Nixon era. It's not getting any better in the mid-70s. Contextually, remember that over in the Middle East, we've had a lot of trouble. You've had the 6-Day War, and then another war in 1973 between Israel and its neighbors. And OPEC has been kind of at a high tide in terms of its power. OPEC being the petroleum exporting countries of the world. They've created this cartel, and they want to stick it to the United States for backing Israel by creating, high prices for oil. And so, we've got high energy costs, we've got high unemployment, we've got inflation. And so Ford, instead of taking decisive action and, doing things like messing with the interest rates and stuff like that, or doing something like a tax increase that would bring prices down and stuff like that. He creates this slogan called WIN, which is whip inflation now. And it called on voluntary actions by both workers not to strike, by employers not to, keep wages too low, by, telling producers to keep their prices down. But it was all voluntary, and nobody was really willing to do that. And so these WIN buttons, they became kind of like fodder against Ford. People kind of made fun of them. And so his whip inflation now did nothing to curb inflation. In the election of 1976, Ford had been president there for a couple of years. And so in 1976, he stood for election, or re-election, as you want to put it, against Jimmy Carter. And so the Republicans, they nominate Ford. But what we need to know is that there's a new kind of kid on the block, and a new force that's coming up in the Republican ranks right now. He is governor. He's been governor of California. He is a champion of America, of conservatism. and his name is Ronald Reagan. And so we're going to get back to Ronald Reagan. He doesn't quite get the nomination in 1976, but he does kind of establish himself as a powerful upcoming force in the Republican Party. Okay, the Democrats back behind a former peanut farmer named Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter was probably one of the foremost intellectuals we've ever had as a president, but he was a little bit sanctimonious. He kind of touted himself as this moral person, as a Washington outsider, and that's really kind of how he won. Was that he was not really seen as a Washington politician. He famously quoted saying to the American people, "I will never tell a lie." And for the most part, I think that's probably pretty true. The problem was he tended to rub people the wrong way. But he was able to get most of the Deep South. This is one of the last times, you guys should know, it's one of the last times that you'll ever see the South in blue. For the most part, really, Nixon had turned the Deep South to Republicans. And, with a couple of exceptions from here until now, we're going to see, for the most part, we're going to see the Republicans dominate the South. And that really started with Nixon. What is kind of interesting about Jimmy Carter is that those African Americans that were actually eligible and that could vote, darn near all of them voted for Jimmy Carter. Really, if you're talking about a civil rights president, Jimmy Carter probably would have been, except he was going against a Congress that would not pass hardly anything. And that's the big reason Jimmy Carter really isn't that successful as a president, because the Congress he was going against was a Republican Congress, and they just weren't willing to pass anything that Jimmy Carter wanted to do. Okay, so domestic issues of Jimmy Carter. This upset a lot of people, a lot of traditional conservative Americans, but he granted amnesty for those draft dodgers of Vietnam War. A lot of people, that fought in the Vietnam War, a lot of the people that were kind of traditional conservative Americans, they did not like that he granted amnesty for those draft dodgers, that they would be allowed to come back into the country, that they would be allowed to not be punished as a result for dodging the draft. One of the most controversial things that Jimmy Carter did during his time was he started the agreement process to give back the Panama Canal to the Panamanians. And I mean, we look at that today and be like, that was probably a good thing. I mean, we should not be controlling the Panama Canal since it's in Panama Canal. Probably Panama should be controlling it. And you can see the picture in the bottom right-hand corner, which is Teddy Roosevelt basically jumping out of his picture in terms of the newspaper saying the U.S. is ready to give it back, when he's the one that kind of engineered the United States taking it over. So that was engineered in the 70s, but it wouldn't come fully true until, I think it's like 1999 actually, but around 2000. But yeah, I had mentioned this before. Really, Jimmy Carter's problem is he's going with a non-compliant Congress, and that non-compliant Congress just will not pass really any of the legislation that he wants. And his biggest problem is the economy. I mean, you guys can see down at the bottom right-hand corner that you're talking about. This is one of the biggest eras in terms of inflation. I mean, the interest rates got up at one point in the 1970s, I think, to about 18 to 20%. So this is just a really bad time for our economy. It's not quite as bad as the Great Depression, but a lot of people will look back at this time and say this is one of the worst because it's prolonged. You can see that really our economic recession is starting in 1971, and really it doesn't start getting better until the 1980s. Okay, whereas Carter was not very successful in terms of domestic issues, he didn't have to really deal with Congress that much in terms of foreign policy, and he was a little more successful in foreign policy. And probably his greatest foreign policy success was the Camp David Accords. So if you recall that Israel and Egypt had been fighting, really probably since 1948, but they went to war with each other in both 1967 and 1973. There's a couple of issues. One, Israel had taken over land in like the Sinai Peninsula that had belonged to Egypt. And so Egypt wanted it back. And so to that end, Anwar Sadat of Egypt and Menachem Begin of Israel, they met a couple of times to try to create peace. And so they were invited by Jimmy Carter to Camp David, which is kind of a presidential retreat up in the mountains of Maryland. And there they were able to work out some of the details to create peace between Egypt and Israel, where Israel would give back some of the land they took in those wars, and then Egypt, they would recognize that Israel existed, and that's big for an Arab country that's vastly predominantly Muslim to recognize that a Jewish state did exist. And unfortunately for Anwar Sadat for doing that, he was eventually assassinated. But this is probably the highlight of Jimmy Carter's presidency, was this helping to engineer this accord between the two countries. Probably the worst foreign policy issue that Jimmy Carter has to face is the Iran hostage crisis. Now, let me go back with Iran a little bit. In the 1950s, we helped to overthrow a government that was not friendly to the United States. But leading up to 1979, there was a Shah that was basically like a king that was fairly fairly beneficial or fairly pro-American. In other words, they would sell us their oil at a pretty cheap price. And a lot of the fundamentalist Islamic community in Iran did not like that, and so they pushed this guy out. They basically did a coup d'état, and then the Shah, what really really ticked off Iran was that he then came into America, and they actually came in for cancer treatment or something like that. But they wanted him back. They did not like the guy. They wanted to put him on trial. They had said that he had used the the police illegally, and so they wanted him back. They wanted to get him out of the United States and back to Iran so they could put him on trial, and we wouldn't release him. And so in response to this, militant fundamentalists, they seized the American embassy in Tehran and basically held people hostage for over a year. Now, what's kind of interesting about this is right around election time. And because of his unsuccess in getting those hostages released, a lot of people blame Jimmy Carter. What's kind of interesting about this is that, literally the day that Reagan is inaugurated as president, Jimmy Carter had helped engineer the release of those hostages. And he should have gotten credit for that, but really it's Reagan that kind of ends up getting the credit for it because he's coming in as president right when it happens. So you could kind of look at this as, something that Jimmy Carter should get credit for, but he ended up really not. Okay, and then the last foreign policy really doesn't have much to do with us. I just want you to understand, in terms of the collapse of the Soviet Union that we're going to see over the next decade, this is one of the big things that leads to their fall, and that is the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. I want you to think of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan as kind of like their Vietnam. So they get bogged down in a huge war of attrition, and it drains a lot of money, and it puts a lot of strain on them politically and domestically at home. A lot of people are against the war in Afghanistan. I mean, really, it is like their version of Vietnam, and eventually what it's going to lead to is the destruction or the falling apart, not only the Communist Party but also of the Soviet Union itself. So we'll kind of get back to that as we get into the 80s. Okay, so next time we will talk about the lead up to Ronald Reagan, and that should get you through the end of what you need to know for the test. Thanks for tuning in.